Well, let's talk now to Richard Blanco. He's a landlord and a member of the National Landlords Association. He has some concerns over the tactics being used by Acorn. Marion Wright, she's 26 and has only ever lived in privately rented houses, often, she says, in poor conditions. She's become a member of Acorn in Sheffield. And we can also speak to Stuart Melvin. He's one of the few paid employees of Acorn and he's based in Bristol. Thank you all for speaking to us. Richard, I want to talk to you. You were watching that film intently there. Do you understand some of the frustrations of tenants?
I absolutely do, and I'm appalled to see those sorts of poor conditions. I mean, landlords need to maintain their asset and they also need to provide a good home for tenants. And the vast majority do. It's just a small minority that, I'm afraid, allow their properties to get into that kind of condition. And I support the fact that Acorn is acting on behalf of tenants to help tenants to get these problems resolved. Local authorities, of course, have the legitimate powers to bring enforcement action and deal with landlords who allow their properties to get into that sort of condition. And, you know, I think it's important that Acorn work alongside the local authority.
Well, before we get Acorn's perspective on that, I want to bring Mariam in just to give us some examples of, you're 26, you've always lived in private rented accommodation. Give us a sense of some of the worst instances you've had and the worst housing you've had.
Yeah, so I note there that Richard said that it's a small minority of landlords who, you know, don't adhere to what we would say homes that would be fit for human habitation. I've rented all my life and I can say the honest truth is that it's been an overwhelmingly negative experience. We've lived in houses where you saw some of the clips where the houses have got mould, the lady there that said had mice. These are typical standards of housing that are available for families. So not just young individuals like myself, but growing up, those are the kind of houses that I lived in. And we were subject to harassment from landlords, illegal evictions, perfectly legal evictions as well also. These sort of experiences, you know, that lady there, as she said earlier in the clip, she pays £850 for that house. Would you say, Richard, that £850, you know, it is perfectly reasonable to live in a house where you have mice and damp?
No, I wouldn't, of course not, no, and I think it should be resolved immediately. I certainly wouldn't let a property like that to a tenant. And,
however,
you know,
that is the norm. This is the norm that faces families. So it was quite unusual for me growing up. A lot of my friends did not live in housing like that. They were fortunate enough to have families who could afford to buy and get on the property ladder. Unfortunately, my family were not able to do so, and they were vulnerable, even though they were hardworking and earning wages which should be of living standard. But unfortunately, especially now where rents are rising ever more, these are the sort of standards that we are facing.
Yeah, and I would certainly say, you know, to any landlords watching this programme who do have properties like that in a poor condition, you know, what they are is poor business people. They're doing a disservice to their tenants and they need to get their heads around the standards that are required. They need to join a landlord association like the National Landlords Association and, you know, run a better business and provide a better product for their tenants. Tenants will then be happier and stay longer. I mean, over 80% of tenants say that they're happy with their private rented accommodation. So, but I am aware that there are...
Where our voices are not heard. So for this reason, we need organisations like Acorn, because it's time that, you know, we got off the sofa, no more sofa politics. It's time people who rent, don't be ashamed. You know, I was ashamed growing up. I don't like to think about the experiences that I had as a child. It was embarrassing having friends coming over and you know, the state of our homes. This was at no fault of my parents. The landlords would fail to take the proper action, you know, to fix broken boilers. Sometimes we would go without heating for months. You know, we would boil the kettle for baths. This is the 21st century. It's time that renting was brought in line with the 21st century.
Let's bring in Stuart, because I want to get his perspective on this. As I said in the introduction, he's one of the few paid employees of Acorn based in Bristol. I think few people watching this would disagree that the landlords who rent out filthy, mouldy, smelly, horrible properties shouldn't be held to account. But are you the people to do it? Shouldn't this be done through the council?
I completely agree. They should be done through the council. We've got a situation nationally where the regulations aren't tight enough. They're not often enforced well enough. Councils are obviously facing constricted budgets and austerity. So often what we're actually doing is representing our members and highlighting and working in partnership with the local authority to highlight the worst landlords in the areas, and then also holding the local authority to account and expecting them to carry out this enforcement work.
We spoke to a landlord who in the past has been subjected to some of the direct action from one of Acorn's groups, and they told us that they felt going around to their house was very intimidating, especially as they say they had a good reputation in the city where they operate. So is it fair to turn up on the doorstep of a landlord and harass them?
Is it fair for tenants to be harassed? Is it fair for tenants to constantly call their landlords and say, you know, I need this repair fixing, and be largely ignored? Is that fair? And where are the resources where if you have a problem with your landlord, who do you turn to? Because that is the question
Mariam,
that I have
isn't it better
faced.
to work with the landlord? Two wrongs don't make a right. And wouldn't it be better to try and work with them? Isn't there actually a danger?
The balance of power
Hang on, Mariam, hang on a minute. Let me
your
just finish the
landlord.
point. Isn't it a danger that you actually get on such a bad relationship with your landlord? It could lead to an eviction, which is then even worse for the tenant.
In the cases we've seen, we've been dealing with that landlord for over 2 years. The local authority have been dealing with that landlord for 2 years, and they've been ignoring those enforcement rights. They often, these landlords are simply not, they're refusing to work, not only with us, but also with the local authority, and they're refusing to live up to these standards. And in terms of evictions, you know, we're campaigning at a national level to get rid of the Section 21, which allows these easy evictions. Your Good programme has obviously covered the homelessness issue and the rise of homelessness. That's primarily caused by evictions in the private renter sector. And again, it's these same landlords that are kicking people out on a regular basis for either asserting their rights or because those landlords want to raise the rent.
Yes, renting it's vulnerable, and you know we're talking about homes. So these are places that when you finish work, when you finish school, you come home to these issues. That you're constantly living with them. So we're talking about people's lives here. You know, their living standards. We are talking about homes. And, you know, often your landlords, they don't want to work with you, they don't want to listen. The amount of times that a landlord has given me a reason as to why they will not fix something, or why it's going to take 2-3 weeks for a boiler to be fixed. These are homes for people like me who earn a good living and we deserve better. The renting community deserve better. Richard, and we're not getting it.
I totally understand your frustration with those kinds of landlords that are behaving badly, but you know the government is bringing in new regulations. There's going to be a redress scheme. Local authorities are having increasing powers like civil penalties.
Local authorities do not have the resources. They may have the powers, but they do not have the resources. Austerity has meant cuts, you know, to environmental officers. You know, the resources aren't there, even if the powers are.
It's true, but I mean, we shouldn't forget that sometimes tenants behave badly as well, you know. So, I think there's lots of scope for landlords and tenants to work together on some of these problems. And of course, the important point here is that, you know, a big part of being a landlord is communicating well with your tenant and having a good relationship with them. And anything we can do to encourage landlords to do that is good work.
I'm really glad to hear Richard say that. I think one of the problems we've got nationally is that these legislation is not being enforced. But what's more, when Richard talks about more legislation being brought in, we have to understand that regulation is being brought in as a result of the increasing tenant activism across the country, organisations like Acorn and our allies.
Richard, do you think there could be a time when the Landlords Association, like yourself and the National Landlords Association, could work alongside Acorn to reduce the heat out of this and actually get better homes for the likes of Mariam, but in a less confrontational way?
Absolutely, and we have worked with Acorn in Bristol to develop a standard for housing in that area. And, you know, I'm very keen to work with Acorn and any other tenants, organisations like that, to try and improve standards in the private rented sector. In many ways, we have a lot in common. You know, I don't want those bad landlords to get away with it. I want them to be brought to task by local authorities. And I agree that there's a problem that local authorities don't have enough resources.
Thank you all for speaking to us today. I'm very grateful to you, and thank you for coming in, Richard.
Thank you.